The Rothschilds may have dominated European banking, but there was another Jewish family, virtually unknown to most, that made them look impoverished by comparison. At their zenith, the Sassoons controlled a staggering 70% of all opium flowing into China. But there's a vital truth often overlooked. This dynasty began as exiles, having fled persecution from Baghdad. The clan that was once oppressed rose to become the most ruthless of colonial parasites. This is the story of a house that learned a terrible lesson. Only absolute power can stop the world from crushing it. Not just influencing Shanghai's economy, they essentially owned it. The docks, the mills, the banks, the real estate, the entire infrastructure. The truth that's often omitted from accounts of the British Empire's conquest of the nation is that it wasn't spearheaded by the British government. It was masterminded by a single family of Iraqi Jewish refugees who transformed opium addiction into the largest fortune in Asian history. They addicted an entire populace, amassed billions, and built a vast network stretching from Bombay to London. And when the whole enterprise collapsed, they absconded with their wealth, leaving millions to suffer the consequences. The British dubbed them the Rothschilds of the East, while the Chinese had far less flattering names: drug lords, exploiters, the architects of China's century of humiliation. But the question remains, how did they do it? How did a family who once sought sanctuary in Baghdad become more powerful than the British East India Company, manipulating empires, instigating wars, and transforming Shanghai into the Paris of the East, all built on the backs of opium addicts? This is the story of the Sassoons, and be warned, it's a dark one. Before we delve deeper into this pivotal moment of destiny, let's take a quick moment to support the channel by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. It helps tremendously. Also, please let me know where in the world you are listening to this story and at what time. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. David Sassoon was not destined to be a refugee. Born in Baghdad in 1792, he was raised in one of the city's most influential Jewish families. His father, Salih Sassoon, held the esteemed position of chief treasurer to the Pashas, who governed Baghdad under Ottoman rule. His father, Sassoon ben Salah, was the Jewish community's revered Nasi and chief treasurer to the Pashas. The family resided in a sprawling courtyard house in the Jewish quarter, adorned themselves in fine silks, and were fluent in Hebrew and Arabic. By all accounts, they were Baghdad's Jewish elite. The Sassoon name carried weight. Salih Sassoon, or Sheikh Sassoon as he was known, wasn't just a financial manager. He mediated disputes, represented the Jewish community to Muslim authorities, and controlled access to Ottoman patronage. If you needed anything accomplished in Baghdad, you went through the Sassoons. David fully immersed himself in this world. By his 20s, he was proficient in 5 languages: Hebrew, Arabic, Persian, English, and Hindustani. He possessed a deep understanding of accounting, trade networks, and most importantly, how to navigate diverse cultures, skills that seemed commonplace in cosmopolitan Baghdad but would prove invaluable in the tumultuous times ahead. By 1828, David Sassoon learned a bitter truth. Wealth and reputation were illusions, easily stripped away by a single political decree. At 36, he fled, haunted by the fear of losing respect and having to start over. When he reached Bombay, instead of trying to blend in like others, David made a different choice. He realized, if the system won't protect you, you must build a system that is untouchable. He chose to flee, initially to Bushehr on the Persian Gulf in 1828. However, Persia offered limited opportunities for a Jewish merchant without connections. So, in 1832, he moved again, this time to Bombay, the crown jewel of British India. It's crucial to understand Bombay's landscape in 1832. It was not the cosmopolitan metropolis it would later become. The British had only controlled it for 170 years. David arrived with his wife, 8 children, and whatever portable wealth he had managed to smuggle out of Baghdad. David's first wife, Hannah Joseph of Basra, bore him 4 children, and after her death, his second marriage to Flora Hayam added 10 more children to his legacy. He rented space in the Bombay Fort area, the hub for foreign merchants, and then he made a strategic decision. He refused to anglicize. While other immigrant merchants adopted British names, attire, and customs, David retained his Arabic name, continued to wear traditional robes, and ensured his sons continued their Hebrew studies. The Sassoon household remained orthodox, strictly kosher, Shabbat observant, and Hebrew-speaking. This wasn't merely cultural pride, it was a calculated strategy. Bombay's economy thrived on networks, Parsi networks, Gujarati networks, British networks, each controlling specific trades through bonds of trust and shared language. David couldn't infiltrate British networks. He was too foreign. He couldn't penetrate Parsi networks. He wasn't born into them. But he could create his own network, a Jewish trading house connecting Baghdad, Kolkata, Bombay, and eventually Canton. His initial steps were cautious, trading cotton, shipping textiles, nothing groundbreaking. But he was observant, learning, and building relationships with other Baghdadi Jewish merchants who had also sought refuge in India, fostering a community of trust in a city where trust was currency. The breakthrough came when he identified something the British desperately needed but couldn't easily access: opium distribution networks. The East India Company controlled opium production in Bengal, cultivating and processing it. However, selling it in China required a different skill set. Merchants who could operate in Canton, navigate Chinese compradors, handle multiple currencies, and crucially, operate outside official British channels, as China had outlawed opium. David possessed these skills. His sons were multilingual, his Baghdad connections provided credibility with Middle Eastern traders in Asian ports, and his outsider status, not British, not Chinese, not beholden to the East India Company, made him ideally suited for the shadow economy of contraband. Soon after setting up, David found the one thing the British Empire needed but couldn't openly manage: the opium distribution network. His commodity was opium, but his true tool of power was the wooden chest stamped with the Star of David on the company flag. This was his intellectual weapon, a sticky black gum used to anchor his abstract theory of absolute control to tangible action. This was not just trade, it was a manifesto. If respect cannot be purchased with loyalty, it will be purchased through utter dominance, specifically becoming the middleman between British production and Chinese addiction. The numbers started small, a few chests here and there. But David understood something crucial. The British would wage war to keep this trade flowing. The Chinese emperor had banned opium, confiscated foreign stocks, and executed dealers. Most merchants would have perceived this as a crisis. David saw it as an opportunity. When the First Opium War erupted in 1839, David Sassoon and Sons was perfectly positioned. While British traders fled Canton, the Sassoons maintained their networks. While other firms collapsed, the Sassoons acquired their contacts, their roots, their Chinese partnerships. By 1842, when Britain forced China to sign the Treaty of Nanking, the Sassoon network stretched from Bombay to Hong Kong, with offices in Kolkata, warehouses in Canton, and agents in Singapore. And with the opening of new treaty ports, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Xiamen, David faced a critical decision. He could remain in the established Canton trade, or he could gamble on Shanghai, a city that barely existed, a port that was essentially mudflats and fishing villages. David Sassoon made his choice. He sent his second son, Elias, north to Shanghai with clear instructions: establish dominance before anyone else realizes what this city will become. But this wasn't the culmination of the Sassoon story. It was merely the foundation. Because what they built in Shanghai over the next 50 years would make their Bombay fortune seem insignificant in comparison. Between 1843 and 1858, David Sassoon transformed from a refugee merchant to the undisputed king of the India-China opium trade. These 15 years were foundational, the period in which the Sassoon trading empire evolved from a small-time operation to a monopolistic powerhouse. The genius lay in vertical integration. David didn't simply trade opium, he controlled the entire supply chain. Starting with production, David cultivated relationships with opium growers in Patna and Benares, the two regions where the British East India Company grew its finest opium. While other traders bought at auction in Kolkata, the Sassoons negotiated advance contracts. They paid growers before harvest, locked in prices, and guaranteed supply. When opium prices surged, as they frequently did due to exploding demand in China, the Sassoons had inventory at pre-surge costs, while competitors scrambled. Then came shipping. David invested in his own fleet, owning the vessels outright. This wasn't just about saving shipping costs, although that was a benefit. It was about control. When you control the ships, you control timing, You control routing. You decide whether to flood the market or restrict supply. The Sassoon fleet grew to 23 vessels by 1850, each flying the company flag, a Star of David, in blue. The fleet grew to 37 vessels by 1880, comprising 8 large steamships for primary runs and 29 smaller coastal vessels for distribution to dozens of smaller ports. Next, distribution networks. This is where David's sons became essential. He had 8 sons, and each managed a different node in the empire. Elias ran Shanghai operations. Abdullah handled Bombay and Kolkata. Sassoon David, yes, literally named Sassoon, managed Hong Kong, and Solomon oversaw Canton before its decline. The company wasn't just a business, it was a family network where blood ties replaced legal contracts. What's particularly interesting is that the Sassoons operated in a legal gray zone that was simultaneously illegal and protected. Opium was banned in China, completely illegal. The Chinese emperor had made it a capital offense, but the British Navy actively protected the opium trade. British gunboats patrolled Chinese waters specifically to ensure opium ships could operate. So, David was breaking Chinese law under British military protection. The contradiction was the point. This British government officially opposed the opium trade, claiming it was a private enterprise with no connection to Her Majesty's government. But when Chinese authorities seized opium or arrested dealers, British warships responded with bombardment. David understood this hypocrisy perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly. By 1850, David Sassoon and Sons was moving approximately 4,000 chests of opium per year into China. Each chest weighed about 140 pounds, totaling 560 dozen pounds of opium annually. The profit margin was roughly 400%. Opium bought in India for $300 per chest, sold in Shanghai for $1,200 per chest, sometimes more if supply was tight. Do the math. 4,000 chests at $900 profit per chest equals $3.6 million in annual profits in 1850, equivalent to roughly $120 million annually in today's money from one commodity, from one family business. But the Sassoons weren't content with opium alone. They were building something larger, a trading empire that used opium profits to finance legitimate businesses, cotton mills in Bombay, real estate in Hong Kong, banking operations, and shipping beyond just opium routes. The cotton business was particularly shrewd. The Sassoons bought raw cotton from Indian growers, shipped it to Manchester on their own vessels, then imported finished textiles back to India and China for sale. They controlled both ends of the supply chain, profiting from the raw export and the finished import, using the same ships that carried opium to carry cotton on return voyages. What's often overlooked is how David cultivated British support. He donated generously to British causes in India, funded schools, built synagogues that British officials attended, and made himself indispensable to British governors who needed local knowledge and local networks. In 1853, David did something extraordinary. He funded the construction of the Masjid Bunder Railroad in Bombay, India's first passenger railway. It cost him a fortune, but it bought him something more valuable than money: legitimacy. The British press hailed him as a civilizing force, a merchant prince bringing modernity to India, conveniently ignoring the fact that his fortune came from addicting millions of Chinese. The truth was far darker. Between 1840 and 1858, opium imports to China increased by 4%. The number of addicts grew from roughly 2 million to over 10 million. Entire regions of China saw their economies collapse as workers prioritized opium over food. Silver drained from China to pay for the drug. The Qing dynasty weakened, and fortunes like the Sassoons grew exponentially. David kept meticulous records. The family archives, now scattered between London and Mumbai, reveal that he understood exactly what he was doing. Letters to his sons discuss market cultivation, which meant creating new addicts, and suppressing local competition, which meant collaborating with British authorities to eliminate Chinese dealers who didn't buy from the Sassoons. One letter from 1851 is particularly chilling. David writes to Elias in Shanghai, "The recent enforcement action by British Patrol has cleared the market of irregular suppliers. Our prices have risen 23% as predicted. Recommend maintaining current volume until local production attempts are suppressed." Translation: The British Navy had just destroyed Chinese opium dealers, creating a supply shortage that allowed the Sassoons to raise prices and increase profits. By 1858, David Sassoon was the richest man in Bombay. His mansion, Sanssouci, overlooked the harbor. British governors attended his dinners. His sons married into other prominent Baghdadi Jewish families, creating an interconnected merchant aristocracy. And the Sassoon trading empire controlled an estimated 70% of the opium trade between India and China. 70%. Consider that. One family, one commodity, near total market dominance. But David knew something crucial. Empires built on single commodities are fragile. Opium had made them rich, but Shanghai was about to make them invincible. When David died in 1864 at age 72, he left an empire worth approximately $500,000, roughly $75 million in today's money. His sons divided the business. Abdullah took Bombay operations, Elias took Shanghai. And it was Elias, quiet and methodical, who would transform Shanghai from a treaty port into the Sassoon family's greatest achievement. Because Shanghai wasn't just another trading post. Shanghai was the future, and the Sassoons were about to own it. Shanghai in 1845 wasn't a city. It was mud, literally. The Bund, that famous waterfront that would become Asia's most valuable real estate, was a riverbank covered in reeds where Chinese fishermen pulled their boats ashore. The total foreign population was perhaps 50 people. There were no buildings, no infrastructure, no government beyond a confused Chinese magistrate who didn't understand why the British treaty suddenly granted foreigners the right to live there. Elias Sassoon arrived in this chaos and saw opportunity. It's essential to understand the implications of the Treaty of Nanking. When Britain defeated China in the First Opium War, they didn't just want Hong Kong, they wanted treaty ports. Cities where foreigners could live, trade, and operate under their own laws. Shanghai was one of 5, but unlike Canton, which had centuries of trading tradition, Shanghai was new, undefined, and up for grabs. The British established the Shanghai International Settlement north of the old Chinese city, literally drawing lines on a map and declaring, "This is foreign territory. Chinese law doesn't apply. You report to a consular government run by foreigners." And in this legal vacuum, the Sassoons built their empire. Elias arrived with capital, connections, and a clear mandate from David: establish a permanent Sassoon presence before competitors understand Shanghai's potential. His first office was a wooden shack on the Bund, 4 rooms, dirt floor, but the location was perfect, right at the intersection where the Huangpu River met the Yangtze, the main artery into China's interior. The initial business was purely opium. Ships from Bombay would arrive carrying chests of Patna and Benares opium. Elias would store them in Sassoon warehouses, then distribute them to Chinese compradors, middlemen who handled the actual sale to addicts and dens. The Sassoons never directly sold to Chinese consumers, too risky, too visible. Instead, they supplied the network, controlled the flow, and owned the infrastructure. By 1850, Elias had established multiple opium warehouses along the Huangpu River and built a proper office building on the Bund. Stone construction, 2 stories, prominently displaying the Sassoon name in English, Hebrew, and Chinese. He employed a staff of 30 people, mostly Parsis and Baghdadi Jews brought from India. What's interesting is how the Sassoons positioned themselves socially. They weren't just merchants, they were community builders. Elias donated funds for Shanghai's first synagogue in 1850, hosted dinners for British consular officials, and married Sarah Haim, daughter of another prominent Baghdadi Jewish merchant, creating family alliances that strengthened trading networks. But the real transformation came after 1853. That year, a massive rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, erupted in China. Rebels captured Nanjing and threatened Shanghai. Millions died. The Qing dynasty teetered on the brink of collapse. And in the chaos, the Sassoons made their most important decision. They stopped being just opium traders and became real estate developers. War is terrifying for most people, but for the Sassoons, it was a buying opportunity. As Chinese fled Shanghai's old city and wealthy Chinese merchants desperately needed a safe haven, the international settlement offered protection. Foreign gunboats patrolled the waterfront. Foreign troops guarded the settlement borders. If you had money and wanted safety, you moved to the foreign concessions. Elias started buying land, lots of it, entire city blocks, for prices that seem absurd now, a few hundred per acre. But this was swampland, undeveloped mud that needed extensive drainage and construction. Most merchants thought he was crazy. Why invest in construction when you could flip opium for 400% margins? Because Elias understood something they didn't. Shanghai was about to explode. The treaty ports weren't temporary arrangements. They were permanent. The British weren't leaving. And as China modernized, or was forced to modernize, Shanghai would become the gateway, the place where East met West, where Chinese merchants did business with foreigners, where capital flowed. By 1860, the Sassoon real estate portfolio in Shanghai was worth more than their opium inventory. They owned warehouses, office buildings, and residential properties. They leased to other foreign trading houses. They became, essentially, Shanghai's landlords. But they didn't abandon opium, not even close. Between 1858 and 1880, opium imports to China increased from roughly 4,000 tons annually to over 6,500 tons. The Sassoons controlled the majority. Their ships, now numbering over 30 vessels, shuttled constantly between India and China. The profits were astronomical. One contemporary account from 1865 describes a single Sassoon opium auction in Shanghai. The crowd gathered early. Compradors and dealers packed into the Sassoon go down. Elias Sassoon presided personally, his voice steady as he auctioned 500 chests in 3 hours. The total sale exceeded 600,000 taels of silver, roughly 800,000 in American currency. Consider that, $500,000 in profit from a single auction in 1865, roughly $9 million in today's money from 3 hours of selling opium. The moral questions were obvious. Chinese officials repeatedly protested. Chinese scholars wrote treatises on how opium was destroying their country. The emperor issued edicts, useless, unenforceable edicts banning the trade. But the Sassoons had British military protection. As long as Britain wanted the opium trade to continue, it would continue. Elias handled these contradictions by simply refusing to acknowledge them. In public, he spoke about bringing commerce and civilization to China, about building infrastructure, about his charitable work funding hospitals and schools. Opium? That was never mentioned in polite company. What nobody knew was how the family was positioning for the next phase. Elias's nephew, Albert Abdullah David Sassoon, known as Abdullah, had returned from Oxford, educated, anglicized, and ambitious. Unlike his father and uncles, Abdullah was completely British in manner and outlook. He wore British suits, spoke English primarily, married a British woman, and he saw that the future of the Sassoon fortune wasn't just opium, it was legitimacy. Abdullah began pushing the family to diversify, invest in cotton mills, banking, shipping, legitimate cargo, use the opium profits to build respectable businesses that could outlast the drug trade. This created tension. The older generation, David's sons, had built everything on opium. They understood it, trusted it, and knew how to manipulate that market. Diversification meant risk, meant learning new industries. But by 1867, when David Sassoon died, the writing was on the wall. China was slowly getting stronger. The Qing dynasty was implementing reforms, building its own military. Eventually, maybe not soon, but eventually, they would have the power to actually enforce opium bans. The British might not always be willing to fight wars over drug trafficking. The family split. Some members wanted to maximize opium profits while they could. Others wanted to transition to legitimate businesses. The compromise was both. Keep the opium flowing, but invest the profits in mills, real estate, and banking. By 1870, the Sassoons owned 12 cotton mills in India, employed over 20,000 workers, and were Shanghai's largest property owners. The opium trade continued, but it was no longer their only business. They were slowly becoming a diversified trading empire. And Shanghai was becoming the Paris of the East. The Bund was transforming from mudflats to stone buildings, electric lights, hotels, and banks. The Sassoons owned much of it, and they were just getting started. Between 1870 and 1895, the Sassoon family reached the absolute peak of their opium dominance. These 25 years represent the most profitable, most powerful, and most morally indefensible period of the family empire. The numbers are staggering. By 1880, China was importing approximately 6,500 tons of opium annually. The Sassoons controlled an estimated 7% of this trade. That's 450 tons of opium moving through Sassoon warehouses, Sassoon ships, and Sassoon distribution networks every single year. To put this in perspective, each ton of opium could supply roughly 15,000 addicts for a year. Therefore, the Sassoons were supplying, directly or indirectly, opium for approximately 68 million addict years annually. China's population was about 400 million. That means the Sassoons were actively involved in maintaining addiction for roughly 15% of China's entire population. 15%, one family, one drug, millions of ruined lives. The operation was sophisticated. The Sassoons didn't just ship raw opium and hope for sales. They had developed an entire ecosystem. First, production control. By the 1870s, the Sassoons had representatives embedded directly with opium growers in Patna and Benares. They provided financing, seeds, and equipment. In exchange, growers were locked into exclusive selling agreements. The Sassoons bought their entire harvest. This meant they could regulate supply, restrict it when they wanted to push prices up, and flood the market when they wanted to destroy competitors. The Sassoons received detailed reports from compradors discussing user numbers and consumption patterns. One chilling document from 1887 noted, "Average consumption per user has declined 15%, likely due to economic hardship reducing purchasing power. Recommends selective price reductions in lower-grade product to maintain volume." Second, quality standardization. The Sassoons created a grading system for opium. First-grade Patna became the premium product, high in morphine content, consistent in quality, and packaged in distinctive Sassoon chests with the family seal. Chinese compradors knew that Sassoon opium was reliable, and this branding mattered enormously in a market filled with adulterated product. Third, financial infrastructure. The Sassoons established banking operations that financed the entire opium pipeline. They gave credit to Chinese compradors, accepted payment in multiple currencies, and hedged exchange rate risks. They weren't just selling drugs, they were operating a full-service financial system built around narcotics. They accepted Chinese silk, tea, or other exports as payment for opium, then sold these goods in London for Western currency. This allowed for extraction on top of extraction. Fourth, political protection. This is where it gets really dark. The Sassoons maintained extremely close relationships with British officials. They hosted governors, donated to British causes, and in exchange, British gunboats ensured that Sassoon opium shipments were never disrupted. One incident from 1875 illustrates how this worked. A reformist Chinese official in Jiangsu province began aggressively enforcing opium bans. He arrested Chinese dealers who sold Sassoon product and seized Sassoon warehouses. The British consul in Shanghai filed a formal protest. When the Chinese official refused to back down, British warships appeared off the coast. The official was removed, the warehouses were returned, and business resumed. The Sassoons didn't even have to request intervention. The British government did it automatically because the opium trade generated so much customs revenue that funding British colonial administration depended on it. What's twisted is that while poisoning millions with opium, the Sassoons were simultaneously celebrated as philanthropists and civilizers. In 1872, Abdullah Sassoon was knighted by Queen Victoria. The newspapers praised his contributions to Anglo-Indian commerce, the opium trade barely mentioned. Instead, the coverage focused on his donations to hospitals, schools, and libraries. The Sassoon family cultivated this dual image meticulously. They built the Sassoon Dock in Bombay, a massive infrastructure project that employed thousands. They funded the David Sassoon Library and Reading Room, still standing in Mumbai today. They donated to Jewish charities across the British Empire. Every act of philanthropy was public, celebrated, and immortalized in marble plaques bearing the Sassoon name. The opium happened quietly in warehouses, on ships, and in the account books that only family members saw. By 1885, the Sassoon business empire was worth an estimated $25 million, approximately $375 million in today's money. But the real wealth was in assets: the ships, the warehouses, the mills, the real estate. Shanghai properties alone were worth millions, and they were appreciating rapidly as the city grew. Shanghai's population had exploded from 50,000 in 1845 to over 600,000 by 1890. The international settlement was booming. Historians estimate that by 1885, the Sassoon distribution network touched approximately 15,000 opium dens across China. Western businesses, including banks, trading houses, and insurance companies, were pouring into Shanghai, all vying for property. The Sassoon family, or more precisely, the Sassoon family as they were known then, held a virtual monopoly, owning, leasing, and controlling vast tracts of land. The family was also undergoing its own evolution, with David Sassoon's grandchildren now at the helm. Edward Sassoon had assumed responsibility for the Indian businesses, Jacob Sassoon managed the banking interests, and Victor Sassoon, born in 1881, was being groomed to take over the Shanghai operations. The remarkable aspect was the family's ability to maintain unity, a feat that eluded most family businesses by the third generation. The Sassoons achieved this through a system where everything was held under the original partnership, David Sassoon and Sons. Profits were distributed according to intricate formulas that factored in seniority and contribution. No one could sell their share without the family's consent, effectively creating a private empire accountable to no one outside the family circle. However, cracks were beginning to appear in this seemingly impenetrable structure. China was undergoing rapid transformation. The Qing dynasty, smarting from defeats in the Opium Wars, was making attempts at modernization, investing in railroads, telegraph lines, and modern armies. Increasingly, Chinese officials argued that opium posed a national security threat and had to be eradicated. By 1890, domestic opium production in China had begun to challenge imports. Farmers in the Yunnan and Sichuan provinces were cultivating their own opium, which was lower in quality but significantly cheaper and free from import tariffs. While the Sassoon market share remained dominant, it faced a challenge not from foreign competitors, but from within China itself. The Sassoons' response was to double down on Shanghai real estate. Between 1890 and 1900, they poured millions into construction projects, erecting office buildings, hotels, and apartment blocks. The Sassoon House on the Bund became a landmark, a massive modern structure housing both offices and luxury apartments. They acquired entire neighborhoods in the Hongkou district. Their strategy was evident. Opium might eventually decline, but Shanghai's real estate would only appreciate. The city was rapidly becoming China's financial hub, its industrial center, and the birthplace of modern China, and the Sassoons owned a significant portion of it. By 1895, the Sassoons' annual opium revenues had begun a slight decline from their peak in the 1880s. However, real estate income was surging, with rental income from Shanghai properties alone exceeding $500,000 annually. The family was gradually transitioning from drug lords to landlords. But even as they diversified and built legitimate businesses, they never ceased selling opium. The trade remained enormously profitable, and they faced little resistance. British protection persisted, Chinese enforcement remained weak, and millions of addicts clamored for their fix. One historical record from 1895 details a typical Sassoon shipment: 3 ships carrying 800 chests of opium departing Kolkata for Shanghai. The moral reckoning never arrived for the Sassoons, not in their lifetime. They died wealthy, honored, and respected. Abdullah Sassoon passed away in 1896, lauded in obituaries as a merchant prince and great philanthropist. The millions of Chinese opium addicts whose lives were ruined to fund that philanthropy went unmentioned. However, the empire's dominance was about to be tested. The 20th century was fast approaching, bringing with it wars, revolutions, and changes that would shake the mighty Sassoon Empire to its foundations. By 1870, the Sassoon Empire faced its greatest threat, not from Chinese authorities or British competitors, but from within. David Sassoon had died in 1864, leaving behind a business worth approximately $500,000 and 8 sons, each believing they deserved to lead it. The partnership agreement David had meticulously crafted to maintain family unity was about to be severely tested and would ultimately fail spectacularly. The core issue was structural. David had built an empire that demanded absolute unity. Every facet of the business, Bombay operations, Shanghai trading, the opium warehouses, the shipping fleet, the cotton mills, was interconnected. Opium profits fueled the mills, which provided legitimate cover for trading operations, and the shipping fleet served all aspects of the business. Disrupting one element risked unraveling the entire fabric. However, David's sons held differing visions for the future and varying degrees of attachment to the source of their wealth. Abdullah Sassoon, the eldest son who inherited control of the Bombay headquarters, sought to maintain the traditional model, keep the opium flowing and maximize profits. The British Empire protected the trade, and China was too weak to stop it, so why deviate from what worked? Abdullah was a conservative, traditional in his attire, orthodox in his religious beliefs, and wary of Western education. He viewed the family business as David had, a sacred trust to be preserved precisely as built. Elias Sassoon, who managed the Shanghai operations, agreed with his brother, albeit for different reasons. Elias had dedicated decades to building the distribution networks in China. He knew every comprador, every warehouse, and every smuggling route. His expertise lay entirely in opium. Diversifying would mean abandoning the knowledge that made him valuable, so he advocated expanding the opium trade, opening new markets in the Chinese interior, undercutting domestic Chinese production, and increasing market share even if total volume declined. Then there was Albert Abdullah David Sassoon, universally known as Abdullah the Younger, to distinguish him from his uncle. Born in 1818 and educated partly in England, Abdullah the Younger represented the next generation and harbored radically different ideas. He viewed the opium trade as a ticking time bomb. While not naive about the immediate profits, he believed it was unsustainable in the long term. International pressure was mounting, and China was slowly modernizing. Eventually, the British government would cease protecting opium traders because the diplomatic costs would outweigh the benefits. When that happened, families whose wealth depended entirely on opium would be ruined. His solution was aggressive diversification. He wanted to use current opium profits to build businesses that could outlast the drug trade, cotton mills, real estate, banking, and legitimate shipping, thereby making the Sassoon name synonymous with commerce, not narcotics. This immediately sparked conflict. Diversification required capital that would otherwise be distributed as profits to family members. Abdullah the Younger wanted to reinvest 62 to 7% of annual profits into new ventures, while his uncles preferred taking their distributions and maintaining their accustomed lifestyles. The disagreements escalated into bitter fights. Family meetings in Bombay descended into shouting matches, and letters exchanged between Shanghai and Bombay dripped with barely concealed contempt. In 1867, Elias wrote to Abdullah, "You speak of legitimacy, like a man ashamed of his father's work. David built this empire on trade the British Empire sanctions. Your cowardice disguised as strategy will destroy what took decades to build." Abdullah the Younger retorted, "I speak of survival. You speak of pride in a business that makes us wealthy criminals in Chinese eyes. When the British abandon us, and they will, your Shanghai warehouses will be ashes, and our family will be penniless." The breaking point arrived in 1867 when Abdullah the Younger proposed a massive investment of $100,000 to construct modern cotton mills in Bombay using the latest British machinery. These mills would be the largest in India, employing thousands and producing textiles for both Indian and Chinese markets. While the return on investment would take years, once established, the mills would generate steady profits independent of opium. His uncles rejected the proposal, deeming it too expensive, too risky, and requiring too much capital to be tied up in unproven ventures when opium was generating 400% returns. Consequently, Abdullah the Younger took an unprecedented step. He split from the family business. In 1867, he established Ed Sassoon Company, a separate firm using his middle name, Elias David, to differentiate it from David Sassoon & Sons. He used his personal capital, borrowed extensively, and independently pursued his diversification strategy. Some younger family members joined him, while most remained with the traditional firm. This wasn't simply a business split, it was a family civil war. The two firms immediately became competitors. Ed Sassoon Company began acquiring property that David Sassoon & Sons coveted, undercutting them on cotton prices and poaching their employees. The gentlemanly competition of battling other British trading houses transformed into vicious infighting between cousins. Both sides spread rumors. David Sassoon & Sons insinuated that Abdullah the Younger was financially unstable, over-leveraged, and destined for bankruptcy, while Eddie Sassoon Company whispered that the old firm was morally bankrupt, living on borrowed time, and incapable of adapting. Chinese compradors and British merchants watched in astonishment as the Sassoon Empire tore itself apart. Remarkably, both strategies initially proved successful. David Sassoon and Sons, under Abdullah the Elder's conservative management, continued to dominate the opium trade between 1867 and 1880, even increasing their market share as smaller competitors faltered. Opium profits remained extraordinary, and family members who remained with the traditional firm amassed enormous wealth. Meanwhile, Ed Sassoon and Company's diversification strategy also thrived. Abdullah the Younger built his cotton mills, which became profitable within 5 years. He invested heavily in Shanghai real estate, acquiring entire blocks when prices were low, and established banking operations that financed Chinese and British merchants. By 1880, Ed Sassoon and Company was worth approximately $300,000, built entirely in 13 years without primarily relying on opium. The family split created something unexpected, competition that spurred both firms to excel. David Sassoon and Sons couldn't afford complacency while their cousins succeeded with a different model, and Ed Sassoon and Company couldn't afford to fail, lest the traditional firm never let them forget it. However, the human cost was devastating. Family gatherings became impossible, and weddings and funerals devolved into cold, formal affairs where branches of the family barely spoke. The tight-knit Baghdadi Jewish community that David had cultivated fragmented, with some families aligning with David Sassoon and Sons and others with Ed Sassoon and Company. The social fabric that David had built to support his business empire was unraveling. The religious community suffered particularly. David had been a major patron of Bombay's synagogues. After the split, both firms continued to donate, but competitively. If David Sassoon and Sons funded a new Torah scroll, Ed Sassoon and Company would fund renovations. While the synagogues benefited financially, they became uncomfortable battlegrounds for family pride. Attempts at reconciliation were made. In 1872, several family elders attempted to mediate, proposing a merger of the firms and offering Abdullah the Younger significant control in exchange for reunification. Negotiations lasted for months, but ultimately failed, as neither side would compromise on fundamental strategy: opium dependence versus diversification. The split also had unintended consequences in Shanghai. With two Sassoon firms competing, they drove up prices for everything. Real estate deals that should have been negotiated cooperatively turned into bidding wars, and Chinese compradors played the firms against each other, demanding better terms from both. The Sassoon advantage of operating as a unified network vanished. Other British trading houses took notice, and Jardine Matheson, the Sassoon's primary competitor, began gaining ground. When the Sassoons were unified, they could coordinate to control prices and squeeze competitors. When they were divided, Jardine could exploit the divisions. By 1875, Jardine Matheson had increased its opium market share from roughly 15% to 25%. The Sassoon firms combined still controlled about 65%, but they had lost ground entirely due to self-inflicted wounds. Individual family members attempted to maintain relationships across the split. Cousins who had grown up together didn't want permanent estrangement, but the business rivalry made friendship nearly impossible. Working for one firm meant access to confidential information, prices, strategies, contacts, that the other firm desperately wanted. Family dinners became intelligence-gathering operations. One particularly painful incident occurred in 1876. A young Sassoon working for David Sassoon and Sons became engaged to a young woman whose family was close to Ed Sassoon and Company. Both firms pressured him to break the engagement, fearing that the wedding would create a connection across the divide that could leak information. This rivalry became so destructive that in 1876, a young Sassoon who married a woman whose family was close to Ed Sassoon and Company was effectively disowned by both firms and forced to leave the Sassoon Empire entirely. This rivalry became so destructive that in 1876, a young Sassoon who married a woman whose family was close to Ed Sassoon and Company was effectively disowned by both firms and forced to leave the Sassoon Empire entirely. He married her anyway and was effectively disowned by both firms. He left the family business entirely, moved to London, and lived comfortably but outside the Sassoon Empire. The split also revealed generational tensions. The older generation, David's actual sons, was dying off. Abdullah the Elder died in 1896, and Elias died in 1880. As they passed, control shifted to grandchildren who had never known David personally. For them, the split wasn't a betrayal of family unity but simply a business reality. These younger Sassoons were also more westernized. Many were educated in England, spoke English primarily, and married outside the Baghdadi Jewish community. They viewed the family business as a commercial enterprise, not a sacred trust. This made them more pragmatic about potential reunification. If merging made financial sense, why not? By 1880, serious merger talks had resumed. The opium trade was clearly declining. International pressure was mounting, and China's domestic production was undercutting imports. Both Sassoon firms faced the same challenge: adapt or die. Perhaps competition had run its course. But egos remained. Neither side wanted to admit that the other had been right. David Sassoon and Sons insisted that any merger recognize them as the primary entity, with Ed Sassoon and Company being absorbed, not merged as equals. Abdullah the Younger's successors refused, arguing that they had built an empire without opium dependence, so why should they subordinate themselves to a firm still reliant on narcotics? The negotiations collapsed again in 1882. Interestingly, this split shaped the firm's different fates in the 20th century. David Sassoon and Sons, still heavily dependent on opium, struggled as that trade declined, diversifying too slowly. When opium revenues crashed in the early 1900s, the firm shrank dramatically, becoming a shadow of its former self by 1920. Ed Sassoon and Company, having diversified decades earlier, weathered the transition better. Their cotton mills thrived, their Shanghai real estate appreciated enormously, and when Victor Sassoon, Abdullah the Younger's grandson, took control in the 1920s, he was running a diversified empire that didn't depend on opium. This is why Victor could dominate Shanghai's property market while David Sassoon and Sons faded. In retrospect, Abdullah the Younger was right. His strategic vision proved correct, but he paid for that vindication with permanent family estrangement. The split also affected how the Sassoon story was remembered. Because there were two firms with similar names, historians often confused them, attributing the achievements of one to the other. The family tree became impossible for outsiders to follow. This confusion later aided the family when the opium connection became embarrassing, as no one could clearly track which Sassoons profited from which activities. Periodic rumors also circulated about secret coordination, suggesting that the split was partially staged and that the firms shared information and coordinated strategies behind closed doors. These rumors were false, as the split was absolutely real. However, they persisted because people struggled to believe that a family would intentionally destroy its own unity. By 1890, the generation that remembered the split's origins was dying, and younger family members knew they were supposed to maintain the rivalry but increasingly didn't understand why. They were competing against cousins they barely knew over grievances from before they were born. Some reconciliation occurred at individual levels, with cousins meeting privately, attending each other's social events, and even discussing business informally, but the firms remained separate. The institutional split, once created, had become permanent. The tragedy is that David Sassoon had designed the original partnership specifically to prevent this outcome. He had witnessed other trading families fragment and fail, and had created elaborate agreements to keep his sons unified. However, he couldn't legislate personality, couldn't force his descendants to share his vision, and couldn't prevent the ambitions and egos that ultimately tore the empire apart. By 1900, the Sassoon name appeared on two distinct firms with different strategies, different leadership, and minimal cooperation. Both were wealthy and influential, but together they could have been unstoppable. Instead, they spent decades fighting each other instead of dominating their markets. This internal conflict, as much as external changes, determined how the Sassoon Empire ultimately evolved and eventually collapsed. When the real threats emerged, Japanese invasion, communist revolution, the Sassoons faced them divided, not unified. The family fracture that began in 1867 never truly healed, and that fracture, hidden beneath the surface of continued wealth and influence, was a crack that would eventually shatter the entire empire. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Sassoon Empire was already in transition. The opium trade, their foundational pillar, was slowly receding under mounting global pressure and changing colonial policy. However, the generations that followed David Sassoon had shrewdly and successfully pivoted that immense wealth into something more durable, a colossal, diversified portfolio of Shanghai real estate, banking, and textiles. This fortune now fell to the man who would be its final custodian in China, Sir Victor Sassoon, David's great-grandson. Born into Edwardian comfort, Victor was a man shaped by war, having suffered a crippling plane crash injury while serving in World War I. His personality was aloof and ruthless, perfectly suited for the chaos that lay ahead. As the Japanese threat loomed and revolutionary fervor consumed China, Victor saw an opportunity not for stability, but for a final, desperate surge of profit, transforming Shanghai into his family's ultimate, glittering fortress against the coming storm. The period from 1900 to 1920 should have been disastrous for the Sassoons. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, World War I disrupted global trade, and anti-opium movements gained international momentum. The British government, facing increasing pressure, began publicly distancing itself from the opium trade. Instead, the Sassoons became richer and more powerful than ever. How? By being more ruthless than anyone else. Victor Sassoon assumed control of Shanghai operations in 1924, though his influence had started much earlier. Born in 1881 into staggering wealth, Victor was different from his ancestors. David Sassoon had been a pious refugee, Elias had been a careful trader, and Abdullah had been a philanthropist seeking British acceptance. Victor was a playboy capitalist with no illusions about the source of his wealth. He walked with a cane after a plane crash in World War I left him partially disabled. He raced horses, kept mistresses, threw legendary parties, and ran the Sassoon business empire with absolute ruthless efficiency. The opium trade was dying slowly but undeniably. International pressure had forced Britain to sign agreements limiting opium exports, and China's new Republican government, desperate for legitimacy, was cracking down harder. Chinese domestic production was undercutting imports. By 1917, official opium imports to China had dropped to roughly 2,000 tons annually, less than a third of peak levels. However, Victor understood something crucial. The dying opium trade had already served its purpose. It had generated the capital needed to dominate Shanghai's real economy, and Shanghai was about to experience the most explosive growth in its history. Between 1920 and 1937, Shanghai's population doubled to 3.5 million people. The city became Asia's financial capital, its manufacturing center, and its cultural hub. The moniker Paris of the East wasn't merely marketing, it was reality. Art Deco skyscrapers, jazz clubs, international banks, the first Chinese stock exchange, cinema houses, and universities dotted the landscape. Shanghai had more cars than any other Asian city, more telephones, more electricity consumption, and the Sassoons owned massive pieces of it all. Victor's strategy was simple but brilliant. Use the remaining opium profits and accumulated capital to buy trophy assets. Not just any real estate, but the most visible, most prestigious, and most profitable properties in Shanghai. In 1926, Victor opened the Cathay Hotel on the Bund, which wasn't just a hotel but a statement. A 10-story luxury Art Deco masterpiece offering the finest accommodations in Asia. Noel Coward wrote Private Lives while staying there. Charlie Chaplin visited, and Wallace Simpson and Edward VII honeymooned in the penthouse suite. The Cathay became the symbol of Shanghai's glamorous, cosmopolitan identity. The hotel cost $500,000 to build, roughly $75 million in today's money, but it generated enormous returns. Room rates were astronomical. The rooftop restaurant became the go-to place for Shanghai's elite, both foreign and Chinese, to conduct business, and the bar was legendary. Victor often held court there personally, schmoozing with taipans, generals, gangsters, and socialites. However, the Cathay was just the flagship. Victor owned dozens of properties: the Embankment Building, Metropole Hotel, Grosvenor House, Hamilton House, and entire blocks of apartments in the French Concession. By 1930, the Sassoon real estate portfolio in Shanghai was worth an estimated $3 million, approximately $450 million today. Most people don't realize that Victor wasn't just collecting rent, he was manipulating the entire Shanghai property market. The Sassoons controlled so much real estate that they could influence prices across the city. When they bought, prices rose. When they sold, which was rare, prices dropped. They were simply too big to compete with. One example illustrates this perfectly. In 1928, an American bank wanted to build its headquarters on the Bund. They approached Victor about purchasing a Sassoon-owned lot. Victor quoted them an absurd price, 3 times the market rate. They balked and tried to find alternative locations, but every prime site on the Bund was owned by either the Sassoons or their close associates. Eventually, the bank paid Victor's price. He had essentially created a monopoly on Shanghai's most valuable land. Victor was also diversifying beyond real estate. The Sassoons invested heavily in Shanghai's cotton mills, and by 1930, Sassoon controlled mills employed over 30,000 Chinese workers and produced roughly 15% of China's cotton textiles. They invested in utilities like electric power and water systems, owned shares in the Shanghai Stock Exchange, and financed Chinese entrepreneurs through the Sassoon banking operations. Consider the transformation. 3 generations earlier, David Sassoon had been a refugee with nothing. Now, his grandson controlled significant chunks of China's largest city's infrastructure, employed tens of thousands, and wielded influence that rivaled governments. However, Victor maintained the family's original edge, a willingness to operate in moral gray zones. While the opium trade was officially dying, Victor found new ways to profit from vice. He invested in Shanghai's nightclub district and financed casinos. His properties housed brothels, high-end establishments catering to wealthy foreigners and Chinese. Shanghai in the 1920s was called the Whore of the Orient, and the Sassoons profited from that reputation. Victor also cultivated relationships with Shanghai's criminal underworld. The Green Gang, Shanghai's most powerful triad, controlled gambling, prostitution, and what remained of the opium trade. Their leader, Du Yusheng, was one of Shanghai's most feared men. Victor did business with him, attended his parties, and used Green Gang muscle when necessary to resolve property disputes or enforce contracts. This alliance was mutually beneficial, with the triads needing legitimate business fronts and the Sassoons needing enforcement muscle that operated outside British or Chinese law. Together, they controlled vast swaths of Shanghai's shadow economy. One incident from 1931 illustrates this perfectly. A Chinese businessman refused to vacate a Sassoon-owned building after his lease expired. Legal eviction would take months. Victor mentioned the problem to Du Yusheng at a dinner party, and within 48 hours the tenant had voluntarily left. No violence was reported, but everyone understood what Green Gang persuasion meant. The Sassoons also played both sides of Chinese politics. When Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces took Shanghai in 1927, Victor immediately cultivated relationships with the new government, hosting nationalist officials, making loans to Chiang's government, and donating to nationalist causes. When Chiang married Sung Mei-ling from one of China's wealthiest families, Victor attended the wedding. However, Victor also maintained relationships with the foreign powers, British, American, and French, that controlled Shanghai's international settlement. He served on the Shanghai Municipal Council, advised the British Council, and hosted visiting dignitaries. He was playing a complex game, being British enough for the British, Chinese enough for the Chinese, and loyal to nobody except Sassoon interests. This political neutrality was only half the story. The other half was financed by the relied on a hidden, brutal infrastructure he both used and protected. It relied on a hidden, brutal infrastructure. The family didn't directly control, but absolutely depended on the triads, primarily the Green Gang in Shanghai, for the actual street-level distribution. They ran the opium dens, sold to individual addicts, enforced payment, and eliminated competitors. The Sassoons provided the reliable, high-quality opium supply, and the triads provided the distribution, creating a system that was nearly impossible to shut down. The Sassoons were essentially financing the entire distribution chain by selling opium to triad leaders on credit. This relationship was mutually beneficial. The triads needed legitimate business fronts, and the Sassoons needed enforcement muscle that operated outside British or Chinese law. The wealth was staggering. By 1935, Victor Sassoon's personal fortune was estimated at $8 million, approximately $1.2 billion in today's money. The broader Sassoon family controlled assets worth perhaps 3 times that. They owned property across Asia, Bombay, Kolkata, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and had investments in London. They were truly global. Victor lived like it. His estate outside Shanghai, Eve's Ranch, sprawled across 170 acres. He bred championship racehorses, and his stable won the Shanghai Race Club Championship 5 times in the 1930s. He owned a fleet of cars, traveled by private ship, and threw parties where champagne flowed like water. and guest lists mixed Chinese warlords with European aristocrats. However, underneath the glamour, Victor was watching China's political situation carefully. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931, tensions were rising, Chinese nationalism was growing, and the communists, though suppressed by Chiang Kai-shek, were gaining strength in rural areas. The international system that had protected foreign privileges in China for a century was cracking. Victor began quietly preparing exit strategies. He diversified investments outside China, moved liquid capital to British banks, and maintained close relationships with British and American officials who might help evacuate assets if necessary. He partied like a playboy, but he planned like a survivor. In 1937, everything changed. Japanese forces attacked Shanghai, and the Battle of Shanghai raged for 3 months. Over 250,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians died, and the city was devastated. The international settlement remained technically neutral, a bizarre island of peace surrounded by war, but everyone knew it was temporary. Victor faced a choice: stay and bet on Shanghai's recovery or start moving assets out. He chose both. Publicly, he remained optimistic, kept the Cathay Hotel operating, and maintained his Shanghai properties. But privately, he was transferring capital and securing foreign, preparing his accounts. Victor braced for the inevitable downturn, yet he couldn't fathom the sheer magnitude of the disaster that awaited. The impending war wasn't merely a threat to the Sassoon Empire, it was poised to obliterate it entirely. The 1937 Japanese invasion of Shanghai should have spelled ruin for Victor Sassoon. Foreign property owners fled in droves, banks shuttered, the stock exchange ceased operations, neighborhoods lay in ruins, ravaged by battle. The remaining Chinese population faced starvation and unimaginable terror. Yet, Victor? He amassed a fortune, an astonishing one at that. Here's how he pulled it off. For 4 years after the initial invasion, the international settlement remained a neutral enclave. Although Japanese forces surrounded it, they didn't occupy it until after Pearl Harbor in 1941. This anomaly created a bizarre paradox, a 2-square-mile bubble of foreign-controlled territory amidst Japanese-occupied China, where the rule of law and normal commerce had completely disintegrated. Shanghai became a haven, a sanctuary. Wealthy Chinese, desperate to escape Japanese control, flooded into the settlement, clutching whatever portable assets they could salvage. European Jewish refugees, fleeing Nazi Germany, arrived in droves, Shanghai being one of the few places that didn't demand entry visas. Add to that, mix Russian immigrants, American adventurers, and British traders who either couldn't or wouldn't evacuate. They all crammed into the settlement, shoulder to shoulder. Logically, real estate prices should have plummeted, with supply far exceeding demand in a war-stricken city. Instead, Victor propelled them skyward. You see, desperate people with money will pay a premium for safety. A cramped apartment within the international settlement offered protection from the brutal realities of Japanese occupation. Victor, owning hundreds of such apartments, jacked up rents by 200%, even 300% in some cases. Tenants grudgingly paid because the alternative was life under Japanese military rule. One survivor vividly recounted, "We arrived from Vienna with nothing but my mother's jewelry and my father's savings. The Sassoon rental agent demanded 6 months' rent in advance, at rates triple what we'd paid for our apartment in Vienna. We paid it. What choice did we have? The Japanese were at the gates." But Victor's wartime profiteering didn't stop at rentals. He aggressively acquired distressed assets. Chinese businessmen, desperate to flee, were willing to part with properties for next to nothing just to secure portable cash. Victor snapped them up. Office buildings, warehouses, entire blocks in abandoned Chinese districts. He paid in cash, secured massive discounts, and patiently waited for Shanghai's inevitable recovery. The Cathay Hotel remained open throughout the war, becoming a bizarre neutral ground where Japanese officers, Chinese collaborators, Western diplomats, and black market smugglers mingled freely. Victor maintained a strict policy of neutrality. Anyone with money was welcome. The bar thrived, breaking records. The restaurant was perpetually packed. Room rates doubled, then tripled. What often gets overlooked about Victor's wartime operations is the systematic way he monetized human desperation. This wasn't mere opportunistic profiteering. It was a calculated business strategy, executed with chilling precision. Between 1937 and 1941, approximately 20,000 Jewish refugees sought refuge in Shanghai, fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe. Shanghai was truly the last resort. The United States had slammed its doors shut. Britain restricted immigration. Palestine imposed quotas. Australia, South Africa, and Latin America all turned refugees away. Only Shanghai remained open, visa-free. You could simply show up. These refugees arrived with whatever meager possessions they could carry. Many had been affluent professionals back in Europe: doctors, lawyers, business owners, academics. Now, they were stateless, desperate, and utterly reliant on those who controlled Shanghai's housing. Victor controlled the lion's share, and he priced accordingly. In 1936, a standard Sassoon apartment rented for approximately 80 Shanghai dollars per month, roughly $25 US at the time. By 1939, with refugees pouring in, Victor was charging 300 Shanghai dollars for the same apartments, same buildings, same conditions. A staggering 275% price hike driven solely by the surge in demand. But here's the truly calculated part. Victor implemented a tiered rental system meticulously designed to extract maximum revenue from refugees based on their remaining wealth. Tier 1 consisted of luxury apartments in Sassoon House and properties in the French concession. These commanded prices of 500 to 1,000 Shanghai dollars monthly, affordable only to the wealthiest refugees, families who had managed to smuggle out substantial assets, often in the form of diamonds, gold, or foreign currency. Victor knew exactly who these people were. His rental agents meticulously screened applicants. If you had money, you were offered the premium properties. Tier 2 comprised the standard apartments in the Hongkou district, Shanghai's designated refugee zone. These were the 300 Shanghai dollar rentals. Middle-class refugees, families with some savings but not vast fortunes, ended up here. The apartments were cramped, often housing 6 to 8 people in spaces intended for 2 or 3. But they offered safety from the Japanese, and that was paramount. Tier 3 consisted of subdivided tenements. Victor took existing apartments and carved them into smaller units. A 2-bedroom apartment became 4 studio spaces. A living room was transformed into a sleeping room for 3 families. The total rent collected from one subdivided apartment often exceeded 1,000 Shanghai dollars monthly, far more than renting the original apartment intact. The refugees in these spaces were the poorest, having arrived with virtually nothing, relying on charity from refugee aid organizations to cover even these minimal rents. Victor collected rent from organizations like the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, knowing they had no choice but to pay. The alternative was leaving refugees homeless, a humanitarian catastrophe. One refugee, a survivor of this period, later wrote, "We lived in what had been a storage closet, 7 of us, my parents, my siblings, and me, no windows, 1 door. We hung a sheet down the middle to create rooms. The rent was 40 Shanghai dollars monthly, more than my father had earned in a month as a lawyer in Berlin. But we paid it. Mr. Sassoon owned the building. There was nowhere else to go." Consider the raw numbers. Victor possessed approximately 800 residential properties in Shanghai by 1940. If even half were generating double or triple pre-war rents, that's 400 properties, x, an extra 200 Shanghai dollars monthly, x 112 months, totaling 960,000 Shanghai dollars in additional annual revenue. At 1940 exchange rates, that's roughly 300,000 US, equivalent to about $6.5 million today, derived solely from rent increases during a humanitarian crisis. While families crammed into storage closets, Victor justified his actions internally with impeccable capitalist logic. He was providing housing. Without Sassoon properties, these refugees would be homeless. The prices were dictated by market forces, supply and demand. If he charged less, the apartments would be snapped up by whoever got there first, and equally desperate people would still be left out in the cold. The price system efficiently allocated scarce housing to those who valued it most, i.e., could pay the most. This was efficient, rational, good economics. It was also morally grotesque. But Victor had long since divorced business decisions from moral considerations. Victor's other major wartime profit center was currency manipulation. Shanghai in the late 1930s faced one of the most chaotic currency landscapes in history. Multiple currencies circulated simultaneously, Chinese yuan rapidly inflating, Shanghai dollars pegged to silver and more stable, Japanese military yen forcibly introduced into circulation in occupied areas, US dollars scarce and highly valued, British pounds also scarce, used for international transactions, and gold bars, the ultimate safe haven. Victor's banking operations allowed him to play these currencies against each other. He'd accept rent payments in any currency, but the exchange rates he offered were deliberately disadvantageous to tenants. Pay in devaluing yuan, and Victor would apply an exchange rate 15% to 20% worse than the official rate. Pay in scarce US dollars, and you'd get a slight premium, but Victor would immediately convert those dollars to pounds and transfer them to accounts in London, removing the dollars from China before currency controls could trap them. One particularly ingenious scheme involved Japanese military yen. The Japanese occupation government compelled Chinese businesses in occupied territories to accept military yen at par with Chinese yuan. But everyone knew military yen were virtually worthless outside Japanese-controlled areas. They were printed by the Japanese army, backed by nothing, and destined to become completely valueless if Japan lost the war. Victor's agents would accept military yen from desperate Chinese businessmen, needing to convert them into something useful before they became worthless. Victor offered exchange rates of 100 military yen for 40 Shanghai dollars, a massive discount. The businessmen accepted it because 40 Shanghai dollars were infinitely better than potentially worthless military yen. Victor then used those military yen to pay expenses in Japanese-occupied territories, bribes to Japanese officials, payments to suppliers, purchases of confiscated properties. He was converting worthless paper into real assets, exploiting the currency's brief window of enforced validity before its inevitable collapse. When Japan surrendered in 1945, those holding military yen lost everything. Victor, however, had already converted his military yen holdings into property and goods months earlier. He lost nothing. The Sassoon Empire did not collapse. It was systematically gutted by its heir. Even before the war concluded, Victor had anticipated Shanghai's ultimate failure and began a secret financial evacuation. Victor Sassoon's banking operations served a crucial secondary purpose: capital flight. China had strict capital controls, making it legally impossible to transfer millions abroad. Victor circumvented this problem by employing a hawala-style system through Sassoon banking operations. A wealthy Chinese businessman would deposit yuan with the Sassoon Bank in Shanghai. Victor would then arrange for an equivalent amount in pounds to be made available to the businessman in London through the Sassoon banking house there. On paper, no money crossed borders. In reality, wealth was constantly being moved, allowing both Victor and his wealthy clientele to evade government controls. Victor charged 8% to 12% for these transactions, a pure, enormous profit. By 1940, Victor had transferred an estimated $1.5 million, roughly $25 million in today's money, to London banks, ensuring his wealth was safe should Shanghai become completely untenable. While Victor managed the capital flight, he continued to profit from every form of human desperation during the war. Black market profiteering. Malnutrition was rampant in Shanghai. Rice prices skyrocketed, and medical supplies were cut off. Victor financed major smuggling operations, storing rice and life-saving medicine in Sassoon warehouses and taking his cut of the astronomical profits. Though not selling directly, he received 30% to 40% of the margins, while goods were sold at markups as high as 1,000%. This created a horrible moral contrast, epitomized by one refugee doctor's account in 1940. I asked the guard if I could purchase some rice for the refugee hospital. He quoted a price that was astronomical, 10 times what rice should cost. Outside, I saw Chinese children, visibly malnourished, staring at the warehouse. All that food, all those hungry people, but no money means no food. Moral justification. Victor's response to such criticisms was pure textbook capitalism. He argued he was performing an essential service, compensating for the high risks of smuggling, and that the black market, however expensive, was better than nothing. This logic, while economically rational, morally transformed the profiteering from starvation and disease into a reasonable operation. Victor's relationship with the Japanese occupation government was the clearest demonstration of his pragmatism. Victor leased, or sold at inflated prices, Sassoon properties to the Japanese military to avoid outright confiscation. The Cathay Hotel Incident. In 1940, when a Japanese general demanded the requisition of the entire Cathay Hotel for military headquarters, Victor performed a masterful manipulation. He negotiated to maintain the hotel as a neutral zone for diplomatic encounters, offering in return to reserve an entire floor of the hotel for permanent Japanese military use at favorable rates. Victor kept his ownership and collected rent, but simultaneously made the Cathay Hotel a part of the occupation's infrastructure. He collaborated to protect his property, an act critics deemed immoral. The ultimate quiet ending came in 1949. Victor Sassoon recognized the arrival of the communists, signaled the absolute end of his empire in Asia. The retreat was comprehensive. The Sassoon mills in India were sold, and the vast Bombay properties were liquidated. The family that had dominated Indian trade for 120 years was exiting entirely. Victor Sassoon himself died in 1961 in the Bahamas. Although his estate was valued at approximately $100 million USD, a huge sum strategically saved, the family's potential wealth vanished with Shanghai. The Sassoon name faded remarkably quickly. Within a generation, most people had forgotten them. The Opium Empire, the Shanghai domination, the century of enormous wealth and influence, all of it slipped into historical obscurity. Today, the Peace Hotel still stands on the Bund in Shanghai. Tourists stay there without knowing it was once the Cathay Hotel built by Victor Sassoon with opium profits. But back in London, other members of the family found influence through social assimilation. Sir Albert's niece, Rachel Beer, became the first woman editor-in-chief of major British newspapers, The Observer, 1891, and The Sunday Times, 1893. She famously helped expose the truth in the Dreyfus affair, yet, like the rest of the family, remained silent about the opium trade that funded her influence. The enduring legacy. Assimilation and public service in Britain. Sir Albert's niece, Rachel Beer, became the first woman editor-in-chief of major British newspapers, The Observer, 1891, and The Sunday Times, 1893. She famously helped expose the truth in the Dreyfus affair, yet, like the rest of the family, remained silent about the opium trade that funded her influence. Other descendants include Sir Philip Sassoon, a renowned art collector and political insider who served as private secretary to Field Marshal Haig in World War I and owned the famous estates Port Lympne and Trent Park. His sister, Sybil, Marchioness of Cholmondeley, became director of the Women's Royal Naval Service in World War II. The family scattered, assimilated, gone. What remains is the inescapable historical question: how should we remember the Sassoons? The family's spiritual and intellectual tradition found new expression through David Solomon Sassoon, who died in 1942 after assembling one of the world's great collections of Hebrew manuscripts. His Opus Ohel, David, catalogued over 1,200 manuscripts, preserving centuries of Jewish learning. His son, Rabbi Solomon David Sassoon, carried this scholarly legacy forward, declining even the opportunity to become Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel to pursue his studies today. Solomon's son, Rabbi Isaac S.D. Sassoon, continues this unbroken chain of Jewish scholarship into a new century. Yet, while the family turned to scholarship and assimilation in the West, their stone legacy remains frozen in time on the Shanghai Bund. Today, the Peace Hotel still stands, an Art Deco masterpiece where tourists sip tea, often unaware that this was once the Cathay Hotel, a fortress built by Victor Sassoon using the profits of an empire that addicted millions. The family has scattered, assimilated, and vanished from the trade that built them. But their story forces us to ask a difficult question. How should history judge the Sassoons? Were they brilliant survivors who mastered the game of empires to protect their own, or were they, as the Chinese called them, the architects of humiliation who profited from the destruction of a nation? I leave the final verdict to you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Are the Sassoons heroes of their own story, or villains of history? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark rise and fall of the Rothschilds of the East, Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of power and history. Thanks for watching.